Standing in London today, it is hard to imagine that this place was once nothing more than a convenient spot on the river, a narrow stretch of the Thames where it was relatively easy to cross to the other side. No metropolis, no skyscrapers, no financial markets, just water, mud, and a strategically advantageous location. And yet, it is here that, over the next 2,000 years, one of the most influential cities in human history would emerge. But London did not become this way through military might. It did not conquer the world, as the great empires of the past did, nor did it maintain its influence through an army. Its strength was different, less obvious, but far more enduring.
This city learnt to control trade, and then money. And it was through this that, step by step, it built a system that allowed it to extend far beyond its own borders and become a center of global influence.
How did trade flows become a source of power? And why, despite wars, crises, and the fall of the empire, does money still flow through London today? In this video, we'll trace the city's journey from a Roman trading post to one of the world's major financial centers and explore how the economy shaped it into what it is today. To do this, we need to go back to the very beginning. The year 43 AD. In 43 AD, 4 Roman legions landed on the coast of what is now Kent. These were professional soldiers, hardened by decades of warfare across the empire, and they didn't come here by chance. Emperor Claudius sent them to conquer Britain, an island that his predecessors had never managed to fully subdue. There was a perfectly understandable economic logic behind Claudius's military campaign. Britain was rich in tin, lead, silver, and wool, and Rome wanted to incorporate these resources into its trade system. The soldiers marched inland, and almost immediately they faced a logistical problem. They needed to cross a wide river somewhere, which the locals called the Thames. It was this practical challenge that determined where the future capital of the world empire would arise. Roman engineers searched for a suitable crossing point and quickly found it. It was the point where the river narrowed to its narrowest point, before widening into a vast estuary.
If you stand on London Bridge today and look downstream, you're looking at the exact spot that brought Roman engineers here nearly 2,000 years ago.
Here, a bridge could be built, and here, a port could be established where ships from the continent could dock. For the Romans, it was the perfect combination of trade and security. By the year 50 CE, they had named this place Londinium. And here's what's important to understand about this city from day one. Many people think the Romans built it as a provincial capital or a military fortress. But Londinium's primary role from the moment of its founding was trade. From the very beginning, the city was conceived as a commercial hub through which goods would flow. The Roman Empire was a gigantic trading machine, and it needed a point where it could bring in tin from the Cornish mines, wool from the British pastures, and lead from the Mendip Hills, and to ship back wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, and pottery from Italy. From day one, Londinium was an economic project, not a political one, and this fact would determine its entire future for the next 2,000 years. Within 10 years of its founding, the city had turned into a veritable hive of activity. By the year 60 CE, Londinium was home to about 10,000 people, which was a huge number for a young settlement. Merchants from Gaul, soldiers from Syria, traders from North Africa, and craftsmen from Germany all lived here. The docks bustled with activity from dawn to dusk. Porters hauled amphorae of wine and sacks of grain, and voices in a dozen languages rang out simultaneously in the main market square. This was the first moment in the city's history when London became what it remains today, a place where money and goods from all over the world converge. The Roman bridge across the Thames stood roughly where London Bridge stands today, and it was the heart of this entire trading system. Every cart of goods, every shipment from a ship passed through this hub, and the empire collected duties on every transaction. But behind the outward prosperity lay a fragility that all the city's inhabitants would soon feel firsthand. Just 17 years after its founding, in 60 or 61 CE, the first catastrophe in Londinium's history struck. Queen Boudica of the Iceni tribe led a rebellion against Roman occupation, and her army marched straight on Londinium. The city was completely unprepared for defense, as it had been built as a trading center, not a fortress. The Roman commander Suetonius Paulinus made a brutal decision. He left Londinium unprotected, realizing he could not hold it, while simultaneously gathering enough troops for the decisive battle. The inhabitants were left to fend for themselves. Boudica's army stormed the city and burned it to the ground. Thousands of residents were killed, and all the wooden buildings and warehouses were reduced to ashes. If you were to dig to the right depth in the central part of the city today, you would come across a layer of red ash several centimeters thick. This is the very fire set by the rebellious Britons nearly 2,000 years ago. For any other city, this would have been the end, but the Romans' response to the disaster laid the foundation for the future of London. Instead of abandoning Londinium, they rebuilt it and made it larger than before. By 120 CE, the new city was bigger, better planned, and surrounded by a massive stone wall, parts of which still stand today, 2,000 years later. If you walk down London Wall or Noble Street in the city today, you'll see actual fragments of the Roman wall, built around 200 AD. Within these walls, amphitheaters, baths, forums and temples sprang up. But most importantly, the docks, warehouses and marketplaces were rebuilt. By 200 CE, about 60,000 people lived in Londinium, making it the largest city in all of Britain. The reconstruction demonstrated a principle that would later repeat itself in London's history many times. As long as trade continued, the city could not die. Even when everything burned down, merchants and craftsmen returned, because there was work here, there was a market here, there was money here. Economic ties proved stronger than stone, and this became the defining trait of London's resilience. But there was a downside to this formula. If the city existed because of trade, what would happen when trade disappeared? Londinium received the answer to this question in the early 5th century, when the Roman Empire began to crumble at the seams. Barbarian tribes attacked the empire from all sides, and the central authorities had to make difficult decisions about which provinces to hold on to and which to abandon to their fate. Britain was too far away, and maintaining it was too costly. In 410, Emperor Honorius sent the island's inhabitants his famous message. The gist was roughly this: "We can no longer protect you. Fend for yourselves." The legions packed up and left for the continent, taking with them officials, tax collectors, and most of the educated elite. The consequences for Londinium were catastrophic, and the catastrophe was primarily economic. Without the Roman Empire, the entire trade network on which the city depended collapsed. Ships carrying wine from Gaul stopped coming, shipments of olive oil from Spain vanished, and the money that had previously flowed regularly from the imperial authorities dried up. Roman coins became worthless because there was no one to pay with them. Merchants dispersed to their homes, craftsmen sought work elsewhere, and officials returned to the continent while there was still somewhere to return to. But the Thames remained the lifeline for trade and travel. This was the main economic lesson that London taught the world, right at the very beginning of its history. It was not Roman walls that made Londinium great, but the flows of goods and capital that passed through it. When those flows stopped, the stones became useless.
Move that beam to the corner. Watch your step.
After the Romans left in 410, new peoples began arriving on the islands. From northern Germany, from Jutland and Frisia, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes began arriving in the mid-5th century, gradually settling in Britain and pushing the local Celts westward. These newcomers were nothing like the Roman city dwellers. They were farmers, people of the countryside and the fields, who did not understand the concept of a city in the Roman sense of the word at all. The huge stone buildings were incomprehensible to them, and they regarded them with superstitious fear. For the Saxon settlers, Old Londinium was a cursed place inhabited by the spirits of the past. Therefore, they did something quite telling. Instead of settling in the empty Roman ruins, the Saxons founded their settlement about 1.5 miles west of the old walls. This happened in the 670s, and the new town was named Londonwic, which literally translates to London Trading Post. The name itself speaks to the main purpose of the new settlement. The Saxons came here not to rule or wage war, but to trade.
Today this is Covent Garden, the Royal Opera House right there. But if you ever sit inside watching a performance, remember you're sitting directly above a Saxon marketplace, over 1,300 years old.
But what happened in the economy was far more significant. Londonwic became a place where goods from all corners of Europe once again flowed, and for the first time in 250 years since the Romans left, the Thames was transformed back into a bustling trade artery. Amber, valued as highly as gold, came from the Baltic region. Whetstones and wine vessels were brought from the Rhinelands, and pottery and metalware were imported from France and Germany. British wool, tin, and slaves were shipped in the opposite direction. Yes, the slave trade was a common part of commerce in that era, and Londonwic actively participated in it. By the beginning of the 8th century, about 8,000 people lived in this settlement, which was a very large number by the standards of Europe at that time. Around 730, the English chronicler Bede the Venerable wrote of London as a marketplace for many peoples arriving here by land and sea. And this concentration of people in one place was explained precisely by the economy. The answer again lies in geography. The Thames, just as it had been 1,000 years earlier under the Romans, remained an ideal meeting point for merchants from various parts of the North Sea. The river allowed ships to sail deep into the country, protecting them from sea storms, and nearby were farmlands that could feed the city's population. The Saxons did not create Londonwic out of nothing. They simply rediscovered what the Romans already knew. Any place where it is convenient to transship goods is destined to become a city. Geography doesn't change, and trade routes follow the logic of reality, not the desires of rulers. Life in Londonwic was bustling, but prosperity had a downside. A wealthy trading city is not only a source of income, but also a tempting target for those who live by plunder. At the end of the 8th century, terrible news began to arrive from the north. In 793, the Vikings raided Lindisfarne Monastery on the northeast coast of England, marking their first major strike against Britain. Coastal monasteries and settlements were subjected to raids of unprecedented brutality. The first serious raids on Londonwic began in the early 9th century, but these were merely reconnaissance strikes at that point. In 842, the Normans arrived in full force and plundered the city completely. In 851, they practically razed the settlement to the ground. The inhabitants fled wherever they could, and along with them vanished the trade ties that had been built up over decades. For the economy of Londonwic, this was a fatal blow, but it soon became clear that the Vikings were no longer coming just for plunder. They wanted to conquer these lands and settle here permanently, and this changed the nature of the threat. A large Danish army, known in history as the Great Heathen Army, landed in eastern Britain in 865 and began the systematic conquest of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One by one, Northumbria fell in 867, East Anglia in 869, and Mercia in 874. only the southern kingdom of Wessex remained, where a young king named Alfred had sat on the throne since 871. It was he who became one of the most important figures in the history of London, not only as a military leader, but also as a man who reimagined the very economic model of the city. During the winter months of 878, the king hid in the marshes of Somerset with a handful of loyal warriors, while the Danes controlled nearly the entire country. But in May of that same year, 878, Alfred gathered a militia and defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Following this victory, he concluded a treaty with the Danish chieftain Guthrum, under which Britain was divided into two parts. In 886, Alfred recaptured London from the Danes and made a decision that would shape the city for the next 1,000 years. Instead of rebuilding the Saxon Londonwick, which stood in an open field, the king resettled the inhabitants back inside the old Roman walls. The stone fortifications, built by legionnaires 7 centuries earlier, provided reliable protection against new raids. Alfred repaired the walls, restored the gates, and redug the defensive moats. The city was given a new name, Lundenburg, meaning London Fortress. The old Saxon settlement of Londonwick was abandoned and gradually acquired a new nickname. It came to be called Eldwick, which in the Saxon language meant Old Settlement. This name has survived to this day in a winding street in central London, which is now called Aldwyck.
If you walk down this street, right here in the Strand area, know that beneath your feet lie the archaeological layers of an ancient Saxon marketplace, forgotten for over 1,100 years.
But Alfred's most significant decision was of an economic nature. He did not simply move the inhabitants outside the walls. He devised a layout for the new London in which shopping streets and market squares were situated as conveniently as possible for conducting business. The king personally allocated plots among merchants and artisans, creating what historians call the first planned economic zone in London's history. The docks on the Thames were restored, warehouses rebuilt, and market rights confirmed by special charters around 889. When the open city was sacked, the next generation of its inhabitants moved behind secure walls, but they did not abandon trade. It was simply conducted now under the protection of stone and a militia. This became yet another element of that distinctive London character, where commercial shrewdness was combined with practical foresight. Over the next 150 years, London passed back and forth between Saxon and Danish rulers, but the city's economy continued to grow regardless of who sat on the throne. In 1016, King Canute the Great, the very same legendary monarch who supposedly ordered the tide to stop, made London his capital. For the city, this meant a new influx of capital and strengthened ties with the Danish trading network, which spanned the entire North Sea. And on June 8, 1042, Edward the Confessor ascended the throne, and his most significant decision concerned the very geography of power. In 1065, just a few months before his death, he built Westminster Abbey slightly west of London, and at first this seemed like a typical royal project, but the consequences turned out to be far more significant. From that moment on, London had two centres that existed in parallel and served entirely different purposes. The city itself, within the walls, remained a place of trade, money, and guilds. And Westminster, with its abbey and royal palace, became the seat of political power. If you travel through London today from the city to Westminster, you are essentially retracing the route that has connected these two distinct centres of power for the past 1,000 years. Merchants would manage money, kings would manage politics, and these two forces would constantly bargain with each other for influence. This division proved to be of fundamental importance because it allowed the city's economy to develop relatively independently of political crises. When the crown weakened or dynasties changed, trade in the city continued as usual. It is this model that would become the foundation of London's future financial power. But first, the city had to endure yet another invasion, this time from the other side of the English Channel. On January 5, 1066, Edward the Confessor died without leaving any heirs, and England plunged into a succession crisis. The very next day, January 6th, the throne was taken by Harold Godwinson, a powerful Saxon earl supported by the English nobility. But across the English Channel, his coronation sparked fury. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that the late king had promised the throne to him, and he had no intention of accepting this. In September of that same year, Harold was first forced to repel a Norwegian attack in the north of the country at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th. And no sooner had he caught his breath after the victory than news arrived from the south that changed everything. On September 28th, 1066, William landed on the south coast with an army of 7,000 Norman warriors. The exhausted Harold rushed to meet the new enemy and faced him on October 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings. By evening that day, it was all over. The Saxon king fell in battle. His army was routed, and William the Conqueror cleared his path to London. On Christmas Day, December 25th, 1066, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The Anglo-Saxon era had ended, and the main question now was what the new king would do with London. William understood perfectly well that London was no ordinary city. Its inhabitants had supported Harold, and trusting them was dangerous. But it was even more dangerous to try to destroy or weaken this centre of wealth, because the entire economy of the kingdom depended on it. The king found a very pragmatic solution to this dilemma. He did not destroy London, but decided to control it from within, while preserving all the privileges of the city's merchants. The conqueror did not disrupt the existing system, he simply integrated himself into it. To ensure control, as early as 1066, William began building not one, but 3 fortresses around the city. The most important of these eventually grew into the Tower, a fortress that still stands on the banks of the Thames today as a symbol of royal power. Construction of the White Tower, the complex's central tower, began around 1078 and was completed around 1100. This tower stood nearly 30 meters tall, with walls up to 4 meters thick in some places. If you stand before the tower today and look at its massive walls, know that you are seeing the very same masonry that the Normans laid nearly 950 years ago. It was a gigantic structure, by 11th century standards, a declaration of power in its own right. Every merchant, every artisan, every resident of London, looking up, saw this massive tower and understood who was now in charge here. But for the city itself, something else was more important. Despite military pressure, the Norman kings confirmed all the economic privileges of London's merchants. Around 1067, William issued a special charter to the city, which guaranteed the residents their former trading rights and also protected their property from arbitrary confiscation. This may seem like a minor detail, but it was actually a huge step. The Norman conqueror effectively acknowledged that London was important as an economic entity and could not be touched. Such a decision was completely atypical for medieval kings, who usually preferred to plunder the vanquished. But William knew that London's thriving economy was worth more than all the riches that could be seized in a single moment. By 1100, London was home to about 15,000 people, and the city was rapidly becoming the commercial heart of all of England. Merchants, artisans, and traders began to organize into professional guilds that controlled specific trades. In 1155, Henry II officially recognized the Weavers' Guild, and by the end of the 12th century, dozens of different guild organizations existed. Guilds of jewelers, fishmongers, cloth merchants, dyers, and dozens of other professions emerged. Each guild established its own quality standards, regulated prices, and defended the interests of its members against the authorities. This was a very advanced form of economic organization for its time, but the true significance of the guilds lay not within each individual guild, but in their collective political influence. Together, the guilds represented a massive financial power that even the king had to reckon with. When the monarch needed money for war or construction, he could obtain it only from London merchants. And the cost of such a loan depended not only on the interest rate, but also on the political concessions the king was willing to make. London merchants knew how to bargain. They fully understood their own value and used financial leverage to secure ever-increasing rights. This long-term strategy became the key to their success. One of the most pivotal moments in this conflict came in 1215. King John Lackland, who had reigned since 1199, had plunged his country into utter chaos through inept governance, disastrous wars with France, and constant extortion. In 1204, he lost Normandy, which dealt a blow to the royal treasury, and after that, he began to squeeze every last penny out of the English people. The English barons, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, raised a rebellion and on June 15, 1215, forced the king to sign the famous document known as the Magna Carta on the meadow at Runnymede. This document is still considered one of the foundational texts of the Western political tradition, and London's role in this story was pivotal. Without the city's support, the entire project would have failed, and the barons understood this perfectly well. London merchants openly sided with the rebels for a very simple reason. The king was trying to impose arbitrary taxes on them, and they wanted to protect their money. In exchange for its support, the city received its own concessions, which were enshrined in separate clauses of the Charter. Londoners secured the right to elect their own mayor, received guarantees against arbitrary taxation, and confirmed their ancient trading privileges. Henry FitzAlwin became London's first elected mayor as early as 1189, but it was the 1215 Charter that legally enshrined this right. This was a turning point in the city's history. From that time on, economic power began to directly dictate policy, and this formula would become London's main weapon for the next 800 years. Alongside the political struggle, the city was also changing physically. Between 1176 and 1209, a new stone London Bridge was built to replace the old wooden one. Its construction took 33 years, which illustrates the scale of the project for that time. The bridge featured shops, residential buildings, the Chapel of St. Thomas Becket, and even a drawbridge to allow ships with tall masts to pass through. The severed heads of executed traitors were displayed in the most prominent places on the bridge as a warning to all who saw this sight.
If you walk across this bridge today, know that this is actually the third bridge to stand on this exact spot. Nothing remains of the medieval one from 1209, except legends and a few archaeological finds.
For over 600 years, the New London Bridge remained the only crossing over the Thames within the city limits, until the opening of Westminster Bridge in 1750. This meant that all trade traffic from south to north and back passed through a single point, and this point generated enormous revenue. The tolls collected from merchants went toward maintaining the bridge and simultaneously into the city's treasury. In fact, this was one of the first examples in history of a toll-based infrastructure that paid for itself. London was learning to turn its geographical location into financial rent, and this skill would become one of the cornerstones of its future greatness. But in 1348, ships arrived at London's docks carrying something more terrifying than any Norman army. It was the Black Death, the bubonic plague spread by infected fleas on rats. The first cases of the disease in London were recorded in November 1348, and by the summer of 1349, the epidemic had reached its peak. Over the course of 2 years, the disease wiped out somewhere between a third and half of the city's population. The streets were deserted, entire families died out, bodies could not be buried fast enough, and mass graves had to be dug right in the fields outside the city walls. One such burial site was discovered by archaeologists in the Smithfield area, where about 50,000 people were buried in 1348. Of London's 80,000 inhabitants, less than half remained. For the city's economy, this was a blow of unprecedented force. Almost all trade came to a halt. The markets stood empty, ships did not come into port, and workshops closed because there was no one left to work. The guilds lost a huge portion of their members, and entire trades were threatened with extinction. It seemed that after such a catastrophe, London would never recover. But economic logic knows no mercy, nor does it know oblivion. The remaining merchants and artisans continued to trade because they needed to eat, and others needed their goods. Gradually, the population began to recover thanks to people moving in from rural areas. And these new residents had an important economic characteristic. They came to a city where there was a shortage of labor, and so they could demand higher wages. Labor costs skyrocketed to 2 or 3 times their pre-crisis levels, and the standard of living for Londoners who survived improved significantly. Paradoxically, in the long run, the plague made the remaining city dwellers wealthier than they had been before it.
Even the most terrible disasters can be turned into an economic advantage if you have the right infrastructure and a knack for trade.
By the early 15th century, London had recovered from the plague, and its population was growing slowly but steadily. By 1500, the city was home to about 50,000 people, and over the next 150 years, that number would grow nearly 8-fold. What sparked such an explosion? The answer lies with one king, whose personal decision fundamentally transformed the economy of the entire country. The main catalyst for these changes was Henry VIII, the very same king everyone knows for his 6 wives, but his influence on London extended far beyond family dramas. In the 1530s, this monarch faced a problem that seemed personal, but had enormous economic consequences for the capital. Henry wanted to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but the Pope refused. The king was not going to accept this, and in 1534 made a radical decision. He completely broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the new Anglican Church, and began closing monasteries across the country. This process, known as the dissolution of the monasteries, lasted from 1536 to 1541 and completely transformed England's religious landscape. But for London, the main issue was not religion. The main issue was the vast amount of real estate that suddenly became available for purchase. The monasteries owned vast tracts of land in and around the capital. About a third of the city's total area was in the hands of the church before Henry's reforms. When the king confiscated these lands in 1538 and 1539, they entered the market and were bought up by aristocrats and wealthy merchants who built luxurious mansions on them. If you walk through London neighbourhoods like Covent Garden, Bloomsbury or Aldgate today, know that beneath your feet lie the traces of this very 16th century economic revolution. All these areas once belonged to monasteries and then passed into private hands. Suddenly, London had room to expand beyond the ancient Roman walls. The city began to literally spread out, absorbing the surrounding fields and villages. New neighbourhoods sprang up where the former monastery gardens had been, and each such expansion further increased the capital's economic power. But this was only the beginning of the transformations. For under Henry's granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth I, who ascended the throne in 1558, London experienced a true commercial renaissance that shaped its character for centuries to come. Elizabeth's reign, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, is called the Golden Age of England, and this is no exaggeration. Under this queen, London became one of Europe's most important commercial centres. In 1599, the Globe Theatre opened on the south bank of the Thames, where William Shakespeare staged his plays. Hamlet, King Lear, Macbeth, all these masterpieces were first performed on the London stage for audiences who paid a penny for a seat in the stalls. The theatre was not only a cultural phenomenon, but also a business. It provided a steady income for its shareholders, and Shakespeare himself was among them. But the theatre was just the tip of the iceberg. The real changes were taking place deeper down, in the commercial infrastructure that was preparing for a giant leap forward. On December 31st, 1600, Queen Elizabeth signed a charter establishing a company that went down in history as the East India Company. Initially, it was a relatively small group of 218 investors who raised £68,000 in capital to equip several ships. But very soon, this company would become one of the most powerful corporations in human history, with its own army, its own fleet, and de facto control over entire countries. How did such an exotic structure for that time actually work? The secret of the East India Company lay in its form. It was a joint stock company where many investors pooled their capital and received a proportional share of the profits. This structure made it possible to finance risky, long-distance expeditions that were beyond the means of a single merchant. If a single ship was lost in a storm, the loss was shared among all shareholders, and no one was completely ruined. But if an expedition returned with a cargo of spices or silk, the profit could amount to hundreds of % of the invested sum. It was a revolutionary financial instrument, and London became its main testing ground. In addition to the East India Company, other trading enterprises operating on similar principles were established in the city. The Muscovy Company, established to handle trade with Russia, was founded as early as 1555. The Levantine Company for trade with the Ottoman Empire received its charter in 1592. The Hudson's Bay Company for northern fur trade was established in 1670. Each of these entities carved out its own niche in global trade and generated enormous revenues for the English treasury. By the early 17th century, London had become a hub through which commercial ties stretched from China to Peru. While English merchants did not yet control global military power, they already controlled a significant portion of the world's financial flows, and that turned out to be enough for a great deal. What advantages did such control over finances provide? For example, the ability to sponsor pirate expeditions against Spanish galleons carrying gold from the Americas. In 1577, Francis Drake set out on a round-the-world voyage funded by London investors, and his plundered booty yielded a 4,700% return for the shareholders. However, the Golden Age also had a dark side. London has always been a city where the glitz of wealth coexisted with extreme poverty. The eastern outskirts turned into slums where the poor, without work or hope, huddled together. Medieval houses stood so close together that their upper floors almost touched above the narrow streets. There was practically no lighting, no sewage system, and garbage was dumped right onto the streets. But the worst part was not this, but the two eternal threats that constantly hung over the city, whose population had already exceeded 400,000. These were fire and disease. In 1665, the plague returned to London. It was not quite the same Black Death that had ravaged the city in 1348, but in terms of the scale of the disaster, it was almost as devastating. During the peak weeks of the summer of 1665, up to 7,000 Londoners died every 7 days. These were staggering figures for a city with a population of about 500,000. Wealthy families fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to fend for themselves. The streets emptied, trade came to a near standstill, and the tolling of funeral carts collecting corpses at night echoed throughout the city. By the time the epidemic ended in early 1666, about 100,000 people had died, a quarter of the city's population, but the city did not even have time to catch its breath. Exactly a few months later, a new disaster struck London, one that in many ways proved even more terrible than the plague. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire broke out in Thomas Farriner's small bakery on Puddings Lane. In itself, this was not unusual. In a city of wooden buildings with thatched roofs, fires were a constant occurrence. But that summer had been unusually dry and hot, and a strong easterly wind fanned the flames, preventing them from being extinguished. Within a few hours, the fire had spread to neighboring streets, and by the morning of September 3rd, it had engulfed an entire district. London burned for 4 days, from September 2nd to 6th, 1666. During that time, the fire destroyed about 85% of the entire city within the old Roman walls. 13,000 homes were reduced to ashes, and 87 churches burned to the ground, including the famous old St. Paul's Cathedral. Surprisingly, only about 6 people died in the fire itself, but more than 100,000 Londoners were left homeless. The economic damage was colossal. Warehouses full of goods, trading offices, bank premises, and archives containing promissory notes were all destroyed. It seemed as though the city had suffered a blow from which it would never recover. What happened next? The same thing that had happened many times before in London's history. The city began to rebuild with redoubled energy. Architect Christopher Wren proposed an ambitious plan for a complete reconstruction. He wanted to create wide boulevards, classical squares, and a system of open spaces modelled after continental capitals. It was an enlightened and beautiful project, but it was almost entirely rejected for a simple reason. Land ownership issues were too complex, and the need for a swift return to trade was too urgent. Merchants could not wait years for architects to agree on ideal layouts. Most of the city's streets were rebuilt along their former medieval outlines, but with one fundamental difference. The London Restoration Act of 1667 required the use of brick and stone instead of wood and straw. This made the city far more fire-resistant and set quality standards that endured for centuries. Christopher Wren was eventually given the opportunity to build the new St. Paul's Cathedral with its majestic dome, which became one of London's main symbols. Work on it took 35 years and was completed in 1710, but the main lesson of the Great Fire lay elsewhere, and it affected the entire economy. After 1666, a fundamentally new financial institution was established, one that forever changed not only London, but the entire world of finance. People began to think about how to protect themselves economically from such disasters. Thus, modern insurance was born. In 1681, entrepreneur Nicholas Barbon founded the first insurance company, which collected premiums from homeowners in exchange for a promise to compensate for damages in the event of a fire. This innovation changed the very nature of risk in commerce. Now, a disaster for one person was spread across thousands of premium payers.
If you're taking out insurance today on an apartment, a car, a trip, know that you're using a tool that was born from the ashes of London in the late 1660s.
It was in this city that people first figured out how to turn risk into a business. And very soon, places would emerge where insurance would become a true science, and the process of risk assessment itself would be carried out by professional mathematicians. It all began with a single unexpected invention of that era, which at first seemed like nothing more than a fashionable habit imported from the East. In 1652, an innovation appeared in London that at first glance seemed completely harmless. The city's first coffee house opened on St. Michael's Alley, run by a Greek man named Pasqua Rose. Coffee became fashionable in the city, and similar establishments began to open throughout the city. These were places where, for a penny, you could get a cup of hot coffee and read the latest newspapers. Men gathered here to discuss political news, exchange business rumors, and strike deals. By 1675, there were already more than 3,000 coffee houses operating in London, and each played its own role in the city's economy. Ship captains, brokers, and investors gathered there, and everyone shared what they knew. Each establishment specialized in a specific topic. In one, they discussed trade with the West Indies. In another, insurers gathered. In a third, stock market speculators sat. Some of these coffee houses evolved into institutions that are still in operation today.
If you walk through the city today and see Lloyd's of London or the Stock Exchange, know that these financial giants began as ordinary places.
One of the most famous was Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, which opened in 1686 on Tower Street. Sailors, ship owners, and merchants would come here to discuss sea voyages. Gradually, Lloyd's establishment developed a specialization in marine insurance, When a ship's captain set out on a dangerous voyage, he could come here and find someone willing to insure the cargo for a certain percentage of its value. From this simple practice, an entire insurance market began to take shape in 1688, and by 1774, the market's participants had officially united into an association, which became the modern Lloyd's of London. How did the insurance scheme work back then? A ship owner would come to a coffee house with a description of his voyage. For example, a ship carrying a cargo of sugar was sailing from Jamaica to London, with the cargo valued at £5,000. Several insurers at the table would discuss the risks. Was the route dangerous due to pirates? Was the captain reliable? And what was the condition of the ship? After that, each agreed to cover a portion of the risk in exchange for their share of the premium. One would take on £500 of risk, another £1,000, and a third another £500. This way, the burden was spread among many participants, and no one went bankrupt if a single ship was lost. But insurance was just one of the ventures that originated in coffee houses. Another venture proved even more important for the global economy. Jonathan's Coffee House, located in the narrow alleyway of Change Alley, became a meeting place for stockbrokers trading shares of various companies. In 1698, a regular patron named John Casting began publishing a printed list of current prices for stocks and commodities, and this list became the first regular stock market bulletin in history. And in 1773, the brokers decided to create a more formal structure and founded what would later be known as the London Stock Exchange. It was the world's first organized marketplace for trading securities, where standard rules for conducting transactions were established. Before that, stocks were bought and sold haphazardly by agreement between individuals. After its emergence, a completely new mechanism for raising capital emerged. What exactly was the advantage of such a system for London over other European cities? The beauty of the stock exchange lay in the fact that it allowed thousands of small investors to put their money into large-scale projects. Previously, to finance a trading expedition or the construction of a factory, one had to find several very wealthy people willing to risk their capital. Now anyone with a modest sum could buy a couple of shares in the East India Company or some other enterprise and become a co-owner of a large business. This radically increased the amount of money available to finance economic activity. In essence, London invented a way to mobilize the financial resources of the entire society for large-scale projects, and this weapon proved more formidable than any army.
But for all of this to work, the stock exchange, the insurance, the trading companies, it needed one thing: a reliable institution behind it all. That institution appeared on July 27, 1694, when the Bank of England was founded.
The impetus for its creation was the war with France, for which King William III urgently needed money. A group of London merchants and bankers agreed to lend the Crown £1.2 million in exchange for the right to establish a joint stock bank with a monopoly on issuing paper money. It was one of the world's first central banks, and its role proved far more significant than it appeared at first glance. The Bank of England was responsible for issuing paper money, managing the national debt, and maintaining the stability of the financial system. When the government needed money for the wars with France, it borrowed it from the Bank of England at a reasonable interest rate. This gave the British Crown a huge advantage over its rivals. How exactly did this advantage work in practice?
The ledger shows the
Let's
balance
look at a
is
simple
correct.
example. In the 18th
Good.
century, Britain and France were at
Let's
war
send word to
almost
the committee.
continuously. From the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701 to the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, it would seem that France should have won. It had more territory, a larger population, and a stronger continental army. But in reality, Britain won almost all of these conflicts. Why was that? Because it could borrow money for wars more cheaply and more quickly than France. The London financial system allowed the British government to borrow millions of pounds at 3 or 4% per annum, while the French crown desperately sought money at 8, 10, and even 12%. It was not the army that won, it was the bank. The financial revolution coincided with another important process that was gradually changing the face of London. the city continued to expand and grow with new neighborhoods. In 1735, Robert Walpole became the first Prime Minister to take up residence at 10 Downing Street, and this address remains the official residence of British Prime Ministers to this day. In 1761, King George III purchased Buckingham House for his family, and over time, this building became Buckingham Palace. The nation's capital was sprouting symbolic centers of power, but all of them played a secondary role compared to the city's commercial heart. The infrastructure was also transforming, and every new structure bolstered the city's commercial power. In 1750, Westminster Bridge opened, finally giving London a second crossing over the Thames after 600 years of London Bridge's monopoly. In 1769, Blackfriars Bridge was built, allowing the city to expand to the south bank of the river. How did this benefit the economy? Each new crossing stimulated commerce by facilitating the movement of goods and people. Workers living south of the Thames could now easily reach their workshops in the north. Merchants could deliver goods more quickly from the docks to warehouses and markets. By the end of the 18th century, London was fully prepared. By 1801, when the first official census was conducted, the city was home to just over 1 million people. It had a banking system, a stock exchange, insurance companies, joint stock corporations, and a network of trading enterprises around the world. But all of this was merely a prelude to the real explosion that lay ahead for the city, because something entirely new was beginning in England, something the world had never seen before. Inventors like James Watt, who patented an improved steam engine in 1769, were creating machines capable of doing the work of hundreds of horses. The first factories were being built, where production was organized according to entirely new principles. Soon, all of this would transform not only the economy, but also the very fabric of London. And most interestingly, London did not play the role one might have expected in this industrial revolution. The city did not become a major manufacturing center in the classical sense.
The factories were in Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, but none of them could have existed without what London provided. So what exactly did London give them?
London provided financing, insurance, a commercial infrastructure, and access to global markets. When a cotton mill owner in Manchester wanted to build a new workshop, he turned to London bankers for a loan. When his goods were shipped by sea to India, they were insured through Lloyd's. When he wanted to raise additional capital, he issued shares on the London Stock Exchange. The factories produced goods, and London managed the capital. It was an ideal division of labour that made Britain the world's economic leader throughout the 19th century. But the scale of the growth that lay ahead still took everyone by surprise. In 1801, during the first official census, London's population was just over 1 million. By 1851, it had grown to 2.5 million. And by 1901, London had become a city with a population of nearly 7 million and held the title of the largest city on the planet. Humanity had never seen such a pace of demographic growth before. Over the course of 100 years, the capital's population increased sevenfold, and this meant colossal changes in everything, from infrastructure to the daily lives of ordinary people. What lay behind these figures? First and foremost were the Industrial Revolution and the Empire. The British East India Company, the very one founded in 1600, already controlled a significant part of India by the early 19th century. After the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, its functions were transferred directly to the British Crown, and in 1876, Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. Across the globe, British ships dominated trade, and the British pound effectively became the world's currency. It was during this era that the concept of the gold standard was born, when all the world's major currencies were pegged to the pound via London.
How did this financial machine work? If you make an international money transfer today, or exchange currency, know that the very idea of the global financial system was born in 19th century London.
The city districts, where bankers, brokers, and ship owners were based, became the nerve center of the entire global economy. Decisions were made here that determined the fate of entire continents. Australian wool, Canadian grain, Indian tea, Malayan rubber, all these commodities were traded on London exchanges, even if they never physically passed through an English port. In 1851, an event took place in Hyde Park that captured the world's attention. It was the Great Exhibition, whose main attraction was the gigantic Crystal Palace, built of iron and glass. 6 million people visited the exhibition over its 5-month run to witness the achievements of British industry. Steam engines, looms, locomotives, navigational instruments, and thousands of other products were on display. It was a moment of absolute confidence in Britain's power. But the most interesting events of that time were not taking place at the exhibition, but underground. The problem with London in the mid-19th century was that it was growing faster than its sewer system. Sewage was discharged directly into the Thames, which had become a monstrous source of disease. The summer of 1858 was particularly hot, and the river stank so badly of rotting waste that parliamentary sessions had to be suspended. This event became known as the Great Stink and was the last straw. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette was tasked with building a modern sewer system. From 1859 to 1875, he created a network of underground tunnels stretching about 2,000 kilometers, which carried sewage far away from the city.
If you walk along this embankment today, know that Basileita's sewer system, built nearly 150 years ago, is still operating directly beneath your feet.
This infrastructure had a huge impact on the city's economy because healthy workers generate more profit than sick ones. Cholera epidemics, which had previously paralyzed the work of London's port and factories, became a rarity. On January 10th, 1863, the world's first underground railway, the Underground, opened in London. The first line, called the Metropolitan Railway, ran from Paddington to Farringdon Street. At first, the steam locomotives blew smoke directly into the tunnels, and the rides were quite an adventure for the first passengers. But the idea quickly spread around the world, and today thousands of cities have their own subway systems, with London rightly considered their progenitor. In 1894, Tower Bridge was completed, becoming yet another symbol of the city. It was a bascule bridge that could allow ships to pass upstream to the Port of London. All these engineering marvels looked like a triumph of civilization, but behind the facade of glamour lay something rather grim. Victorian London was a city of monstrous inequality. The rich lived in Mayfair and Belgravia, in mansions with dozens of rooms and well-trained servants. Their lives were filled with balls, theatres, trips to continental Europe, and endless entertainment. And just a few kilometres from these palaces, in the neighbourhoods of East London, the poor huddled together in conditions that are hard for a modern person to even imagine. Entire families lived in a single room without heating or plumbing. Children worked in factories for 14 hours a day for a few pennies a day. Cholera outbreaks in 1832, 1848, and 1854 claimed thousands of lives, striking precisely these poor neighbourhoods. It was not until 1854 that Dr. John Snow managed to prove that cholera spreads through contaminated water, not through the air, as had previously been believed. His investigation of the outbreak in Soho became a classic example of medical statistics. He mapped all the cases and discovered that they were concentrated around a single water pump on Broad Street. When the handle of that pump was removed, the epidemic began to subside. This was one of the major discoveries in the history of epidemiology, but it would take decades more to fully resolve the problem of water contamination in London. And what about other challenges of city life? Crime in London had reached monstrous proportions. In 1829, Sir Robert Peel founded the Metropolitan Police, the world's first professional police force. In his honour, police officers came to be called bobbies, a nickname that has stuck to this day. But even the police could not cope with all the crimes. In 1888, a maniac appeared in the Whitechapel district. nicknamed Jack the Ripper. From August to November 1888, he murdered at least 5 women, and he was never found. This case became a symbol of the dark underbelly of Victorian London, a reminder that beneath the glitter of imperial power lay the depths of poverty and violence. Charles Dickens perfectly captured this complex and contradictory reality in his novels, published between 1836 and 1870. In his books, a city of workhouses came to life, where the destitute were forced to labor for a bowl of gruel. A city of slums, where children grew up in unsanitary conditions and died of tuberculosis. A city of factories, where workers lost their hands in machinery and became disabled without any support. And at the same time, a city of balls, lavish dinners, and endless wealth. But what role did the city's economy play in all of this?
Despite all the contradictions, all the inequality, London never stopped being the financial center of the world.
By the end of the 19th century, the city had reached its imperial peak in monetary terms. About 40% of all global investments passed through its banks. The London Stock Exchange listed shares of companies from Argentina, the United States, Russia, Japan, Australia, and dozens of other countries. If a railway was being built, gold was being mined, or a telegraph cable was being laid anywhere in the world, there was a 50-50 chance that the money for it came from London. Hundreds of ships were unloaded every day in the Port of London. According to data from 1900, approximately 10 million tons of cargo passed through the capital's docks annually. Raw materials arrived from India, cotton from Egypt, meat from Argentina, gold from South Africa, tea from China, and rubber from Malaya. From London, all these resources were distributed to global markets, and every transaction brought the British commissions, insurance premiums, and bank interest. It was a perfect machine for extracting profit from world trade, operating without a single shot being fired. If you walk through the city today and see the buildings of the Bank of England, the Royal Exchange, and the London Stock Exchange, you will see the very same architecture that stood here in the Victorian era. These buildings were constructed not merely as offices, but as symbols of the unbreakable financial power of the empire on which the sun never sets. But even the most perfect machines become obsolete, and the 20th century would bring trials to London that no city had ever seen before. The first blow to the imperial system would begin to take shape as early as August 1914, when Europe would suddenly find itself engulfed in the flames of a world war. World War I began for Britain on August 4, 1914, when the government declared war on Germany in response to the German invasion of neutral Belgium. London was not on the front lines, but it experienced the full brunt of the global conflict. Over the course of the 4-year war, about 5 million Britons served in the trenches, and nearly 900,000 of them never returned home. Black mourning ribbons appeared in the windows of homes across the city where death notices had been delivered. An entire generation of men was mowed down by machine gun fire and poison gas, and this demographic shock was felt in London for many decades after the war ended. But the city's physical infrastructure, on the whole, survived World War I without serious damage. German Zeppelins carried out air raids on London beginning on May 31, 1915, which was a completely new experience for the city's residents. London was the first city in history to be subjected to aerial bombardment. In total, about 700 people died in these raids during the war, and compared to the coming World War II, these were insignificant numbers. But what a blow the London economy took. The city's financial system continued to operate. The port functioned, and trade continued, albeit on a limited scale. By November 11, 1918, the war had ended with a victory for the Entente, and it seemed that the British Empire had retained its dominant position in the world.
But that was an illusion.
World War I dealt such a blow to the British economy that it never fully recovered. Huge war expenditures amounting to about £9 billion emptied the treasury.
Britain went from the world's biggest creditor to one of its biggest debtors.
Debts to the United States rose to astronomical sums, reaching about $4.5 billion by 1919. The center of global finance gradually began to shift from London to New York. It was a slow process, but it was inevitable. At the same time, the empire's colonies began to demand independence, and it became increasingly difficult to keep them within a single political entity. In 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, and the Great Depression hit London with double the force because the city's economy was closely tied to American finance. By 1932, unemployment in the capital had reached 17%. But London's real ordeal was yet to come, and it turned out to be far more devastating than World War I. World War II came to London quite differently than the first. On September 3, 1939, Britain declared war on Germany following the German invasion of Poland. After the defeat of France in June 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered the bombing of Britain, hoping to force it to surrender or to prepare a foothold for an invasion. The German Luftwaffe concentrated its attacks on London, seeking to break the population's will to resist. From September 7, 1940 to May 11, 1941, the city was bombed for 57 consecutive nights during the initial phase, and then for many more months with lesser intensity. This period went down in history as the Blitz. Every night, hundreds of German bombers flew over the English Channel and dropped tons of explosives on residential neighborhoods. The streets lay in ruins, fires raged until dawn, and residents hid in subway tunnels, which had become makeshift bomb shelters. By the end of the Blitz, about 170,000 people were spending the night in the subway every night. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to piles of rubble, and every morning Londoners had to go out and see what was left of their homes. If you walk through the City of London today and see unusual vacant lots or modern buildings amid the old architecture, know that these are the traces of German bombs that fell here over 80 years ago. How could the city's economy function at all under such conditions? Remarkably, the City of London didn't break down either. The famous photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral standing amid smoke and flames on the night of December 29, 1940, became a symbol of British resistance. Despite all the horrors of the bombings, Londoners continued to go to work, run their businesses, and lead their normal lives. Shops opened in the morning, even if their windows were shattered. Theatres continued to put on performances, and during intermissions, audiences discussed where and when the latest explosions had occurred. Banks in the city operated every working day, even when their buildings were damaged. Newspapers were published every day, and they carried not only news from the front but also regular announcements and even advertisements. It was a collective demonstration of what might be called the London spirit. The city was burning, but it did not give in. And how severe were the consequences of the war for the capital? By May 1945, about 1 million buildings in London had been damaged or completely destroyed. About 30,000 city residents were killed, and even more were wounded. For the city, it was the worst catastrophe since the Great Fire of 1666. But just as before, something new began to rise from the ashes. Post-war London faced enormous challenges. The treasury was empty, the empire was crumbling, and entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. In 1945, Britain's national debt stood at about 250% of gross domestic product, a record high in the country's history. In 1947, India gained independence, marking the beginning of the end of the British Empire as a political entity. It was followed by Burma in 1948, Ceylon in 1948, Malaya in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and dozens of other colonies. It seemed that the city had lost its global role forever, but in reality, things were quite different. London had long been adept at separating political form from economic substance. The empire might be falling apart, but the financial ties built over centuries were not going anywhere. The city's banks continued to serve clients around the world. Lloyd's insurance companies continued to cover the risks of international trade, including new types of risks, such as air cargo insurance. The London Stock Exchange continued to operate, though it lagged behind New York in terms of trading volume. And most importantly, by this time, the English language had definitively become the language of global trade. If today most transactions on the international stock market are conducted in English, and the dollar and the pound remain key reserve currencies, know that this is a direct legacy of the London financial infrastructure that was built over centuries. The adjustment was painful, but it worked, and gradually the city began to find its new role in a changed world. What was everyday life like for ordinary citizens in the post-war period? The post-war years proved difficult for Londoners. Food ration cards remained in effect until 1954, and many goods remained in short supply even 9 years after the war ended. In December 1952, the city was engulfed by the so-called Great Smog, which arose from coal smoke mixing with fog. From December 5th to 9th, visibility dropped to nearly zero. Public transportation came to a halt, and over the course of 5 days, approximately 12,000 people died from respiratory illnesses. It was a true environmental disaster, following which the government passed the Clean Air Act in 1956, banning the use of coal in many parts of the city. But despite all the difficulties, the city began to gradually revive and find new forms of self-expression. In May 1951, the Festival of Britain took place on the south bank of the Thames, intended to symbolize the beginning of a new era. Over the course of 5 months, the exhibition was visited by about 8.5 million people. New neighborhoods were built, social housing was developed, and in 1948 the National Health Service was established, which is still in operation today. Most importantly, people from the former colonies began arriving in London en masse, and this changed not only the city's demographics, but also its economy. On June 22nd, 1948, the ship Empire Windrush brought the first large group of 492 immigrants from the Caribbean islands. They were followed by waves of immigrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and later from Africa and Eastern Europe. These people became the new workforce for London's post-war economy. They worked in hospitals, drove buses, laboured in factories, and gradually started their own businesses. The city's ethnic makeup was changing, transforming it into something entirely new for Britain. But the major economic transformations were yet to come for London in the final decades of the 20th century. What is the main lesson of this whole story? London built its empire not with an army, but with intelligence, money, and the ability to never give up until the very end. If you found this video interesting, please like it and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead about the great cities that changed the world. Let me know in the comments which city you'd like to see in the next episode.